Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by
Matthew Sheffield, the editor of praxis.ink.
Yeah, thanks for being here with me, Matthew. I wanted to talk to you about an article you had written recently about how the conservative media and the echo chamber that it has created really made both the conservative movement and the Republican Party susceptible to the kind of takeover we've seen from Donald Trump and his cohort of voters. I find a lot attractive about your argument, some things that I have problems with, and a couple things where I don't think you go far enough. But first, I wanted to have you kind of lay out what you wrote about, why you thought it was important, and, maybe some of the solutions that we might be able to look at.
Okay, well, I guess let's just start with the argument. The idea is that since the emergence of talk radio and Fox News and various right-leaning websites, a lot of people in the conservative world have this idea that their thoughts and political agenda items are something that the general public is aware of. And as it turns out, that's completely not true at all. And so it seems a bit counterintuitive at first, and this is why I had to write an immensely long article, because a lot of times over the years, I've been writing about media, both for and analyzing media both for conservative and non-conservative publications for many years. And one of the things I always got from conservatives was, well, who cares about what the mainstream media are up to? Because I don't watch those guys. I don't read the New York Times. Who watches NBC News? Nobody. It's all irrelevant. And what we're going to do here is we're telling the truth to America, and they're all going to listen. And that's an attitude that's really been around for a long time, but especially since Fox News became the #1 rated cable channel. But the thing about that is that basically almost no one is watching cable news at any given moment. So, for instance, the ratings for Bill O'Reilly's program, which is the #1 show on all cable news programs, is about 3 million people. So that means 3 million people out of a country of over 300 million people are watching Bill O'Reilly. And it's the numbers are really quite staggering when you add them up, that even if you factor in every single Fox News show as to be right-leaning or conservative, which may not necessarily be the case, especially with Shepard Smith, the numbers for all of those Fox programs are dwarfed by the ratings for programs in aggregate of ABC News, NBC News, CNN, CBS, CNBC, etc. I mean, and then that's not even counting the comedy news programs, which are very popular, especially for younger people, like The Daily Show or the John Oliver Last Week Tonight Show on HBO. And all of those are uniformly left-leaning, much more than the mainstream press are. And so, basically, even if you add in all of those, the Fox programs all together, it counts to basically a very tiny percentage of the programs, of the number of people who are watching stuff from left-leaning mainstream organizations. And there's a temptation to think that the internet has also made some sort of equalizing force. And that's true that it's made it easier to publish and acquire some size of an audience, but honestly, the numbers in that regard are also very lopsided for conservatives. And so, like, for instance, the Pew Research Center did a really fascinating poll in 2014, which for some reason didn't get as much publicity as I thought it should have. And that poll discussed about how they looked at the respondents' media habits and what they were looking at in terms of news and reading and listening. And to the extent that they were even aware of various sources. And as it turned out, within a given week, the number of people who were watching or listening to Sean Hannity in a given week was about 9% of Americans. That was it. And this is a guy who's on TV every single day and also has a nationally syndicated radio program. And he actually was the number one the number one conservative media source after Fox News. But as it turns out, even a lot of people were not even aware of Sean Hannity, didn't even know who he was. As it turned out, in the Pew data, a majority of the respondents had never even heard of Sean Hannity, and that's quite a a fascinating stat, because a lot of people, again, on the right, think that conservative media has this massive influence, and they just don't. And then the other thing is that news outlets that are trusted and valued by conservatives tend to be regarded as untrustworthy by the rest of America. So, for instance, 84% of people who were rated as consistently conservative, quote unquote, by Pew, using objective criteria for their views rather than allowing people to sort of define themselves. 84% of the consistently conservative people were watching Fox News in a given week. But if you were looking at people who had sort of mixed political beliefs, only 39% of them were watching Fox News in a given week. And one of the other fascinating things is that people who Pew described as mostly conservative actually preferred mainstream media sources more than conservative media sources. So, for instance, in a given week, mostly conservative people, only 19% of them were watching or listening to Sean Hannity. Only 17% were watching or were listening to Rush Limbaugh in a given week. And if you compare that to mainstream sources, you've got ABC 32, CBS 24, NBC 29, CNN 32, and actually, amusingly enough, MSNBC was 23%. Mm-hmm. So MSNBC among mostly conservative people is actually more popular than Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh,
right,
or Glenn Beck, or any of those other, or websites like Breitbart. It's just, so basically the only people who are watching or listening to conservative media are conservatives. And that's a serious issue in terms of being able to be aware of what you can do in politics. There's the old saying that politics is the art of the possible. But if you don't know what's possible, then you're going to have a very distorted and unrealistic expectation of politics. And you can see that as the rise of conservative media has become more, as conservative media organizations have become more dominant among Republican, hardcore conservatives. The number of things that conservatives think can be done has grown immensely out of proportion. Like, for instance, Ronald Reagan never actually managed to cut the domestic spending for more than 1 year of his entire presidency. And during his presidency, he only eliminated one program from the entirety of the federal budget, which was then actually replaced by another one. So Ronald Reagan, who people have been deifying as some sort of, conservative master, even he couldn't do those things. But now conservatives, thanks to the conservative media echo chamber, have gotten it into their heads that Barack Obama was going to voluntarily get rid of Obamacare. So right. Ronald Reagan couldn't cut a single program, but conservatives are going to get Barack Obama to get rid of his signature achievement. It's ridiculous, and the reason they got that way, though, that these ridiculous viewpoints became so popular and so, so considered to be possible by a lot of conservatives, is that they are not aware of what the general public thinks. So, and going back to another survey that Pew did in 2012, they looked at the presidential campaign and some news stories that were hot among conservatives. So like the Benghazi, Libya attack of the previous year, they asked people in the general public, are you paying attention to the Benghazi story? Are you paying attention to the IRS story? And as it turned out, this was Gallup, sorry. As it turned out, those two stories were rated the lowest percentage aware or paying attention of any story that Gallup had ever polled. And that makes sense because if you look at the conservative press, which was literally talking about these stories every single day, I mean, Fox even now has basically, in many ways, been a almost full-time Benghazi channel since 2011. They literally talk about it at least 30 times a day between their different programs. But the general public just simply isn't watching Fox. And so they weren't aware of any of the stuff that was being discussed by Fox. And so that's a serious problem for conservatives because they think that the Americans are aware of their views when in fact they're largely completely unaware.
So my question is, I think you make a good case that, an incredibly small percentage of America is paying attention to the most popular conservative news organizations and websites and whatever you have that they kind of built up. But like you said, O'Reilly's audience is 3 million people, and he's the most popular Fox host. But are those people who are those hardcore conservative news media consumers, and these numbers are much larger, I think, for radio. Sean Hannity's radio programs numbers dwarf his Fox News programs numbers, and Rush Limbaugh is, I don't remember what the most recent numbers are, but I think he claims 20 million or 25 million listeners a week, which is much, much larger, obviously, than the numbers that you're talking about. Are these the people who are kind of the grassroots Republican voters? I mean, Donald Trump won the nomination with, 13 million votes, 14 million votes, which is 5% of the American population and maybe 20% of the American voting age engaged population. So are the people who are consuming this media, like, by and large, the Republican grassroots voters? Or, a huge swath of America identifies as conservative, but not all of those people, like you outlined, are listening to Fox News, are reading conservative news websites. Presumably a lot of the people who, in that survey that you cited, didn't know who Sean Hannity was, are Republicans and are GOP voters. What's the kind of breakdown in the Republican voting block of the people who are hardcore conservative media consumers versus the people who aren't?
Well, I don't know that there has ever been anything specifically looking at the media habits of people versus their voting. But if you look at the, I went and looked at the vote totals of every single state in the 2012 Republican primary and the 2016 Republican primaries. And what I found was that Mitt Romney won the Republican nomination with 0.5% more percentage higher than Donald Trump did. And so, and it's something that I frequently hear from never Trump people who have this, frankly, delusional idea that Trump doesn't represent the views of average Republicans or conservatives. They don't know what they're talking about, and they haven't looked at the data because, as the field for Republican nominees has continued to explode every year with all kinds of unqualified also rans coming in, and this year many people who actually had some experience. You had 17 major candidates, if you will, this year, and so Donald Trump managed to get 0.5% less of a percentage than Romney did. And of course, he received many millions more votes total than Romney did before he got the nomination. And so, but when people have also looked at the numbers for party, sort of self-identified ideology, Donald Trump received more votes from conservatives than any other candidate did as well. So there's a lot of misunderstanding on the part of people who want to imagine that Trump is not, that he's some sort of aberration. He's simply not. Mm-hmm. He's an apotheosis, as I've said in another piece.
Yeah, I think I didn't go through state by state like you did, but I think looking at kind of what happened in the race, the story that people tell about Mitt Romney is, he had this large base of built-in support, and as other candidates dropped out, he kind of consolidated more and more and more of the vote. And the story that the anti-Trump faction wanted to tell themselves was that Donald Trump had this large base of built-in support like Mitt Romney, but that as other candidates dropped out, Trump was kind of a niche candidate who wouldn't be attracting large percentages of those people whose first choice was a different candidate. And that doesn't look to be what happened at all. It looks almost exactly like what happened with Mitt Romney, and that as more candidates dropped out, Donald Trump was able to consolidate a larger and larger percentage of the Republican vote. So to the contrary of saying that, Kasich dropping out would have increased almost 100%, gone straight to Marco Rubio, doesn't look to be the case. That actually there were a sizable percentage of Kasich voters whose second choice, or at least, once he was gone, or would have been gone because he stayed in the race for a ridiculously long time and shouldn't have, would have gone to Donald Trump anyway.
That was true from the very beginning. So I wrote a piece in I think it was July or August of last year, in which I noted that polls showed that if you looked at the percentage of people who were right out of the gate identifying themselves as supporting Trump, they were a mix of people from self-described moderates, self-described conservatives, self-described liberals, and actually Trump drew the strongest percentage of people initially from people who were moderate or liberal, and so that's exactly what happened with Kasich and with some of the other candidates who tried to pass themselves off as that.
Yeah.
And so they're just and then it was clear to me, and this was another example I think of conservative blindness due to their media cocoons, that we had the issue that so in the fall of last year, there were several liberal writers who were beginning to think that, you know what, Trump actually has a stable base of support. And I wrote something at the end of November talking about how I thought that if there was a three-way race, that Donald Trump was going to win it. And I got people were very upset at me for saying that. But that was the reality. Mm-hmm. And there was this, and if you recall back to that time, there was this idea among a lot of people, and this was also within the mainstream press, but it was totally unfounded, that there was somehow going to be a two-way race between Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. Right. And the numbers never showed that in any way. Yeah. Because Trump had a very broad base of support. And in a lot of ways, the 2016 primaries, it was a replay of 2008 with John McCain. Yeah. That you had a nominee who was regarded as unacceptable by many movement conservatives, but they couldn't do anything about it. And that's notable because, this time around, the talk radio and televised punditry was split with regard to Trump, and you could argue perhaps that it was the majority of the hosts were against Trump. Mm-hmm. But when in 2008, it was absolutely 100% that talk radio was against John McCain.
Right.
And they couldn't do anything about it because not even Republicans are watching or listening to conservative media outlets. They don't care about them. Only hardcore conservatives care what Bill O'Reilly thinks or what Sean Hannity or Mark Levin or any of those guys think. So they couldn't even beat John McCain, somebody that they all agreed was a horrible candidate and who was going to lose. And so that should have foreshadowed to a lot of people that Trump was going to win, despite the objections of the conservatives.
Right. So then
or some conservatives.
What sway do you think kind of this... You've outlined a good problem that conservatives are stuck in these media bubbles, be it talk radio, cable news, kind of non-mainstream conservative news websites. But what kind of real sway do you think that has with Republican voters, the Republican Party, conservatives in general? If the conservative media can't, like you said happened in 2008, actually persuade enough people in a Republican primary, which, again, is a very small percentage of the population voting in that, if they can't make that kind of a difference, then what kind of problem are we looking at kind of effectively? Because to me, if a small and ultimately insignificant number of people are watching and reading conservative media in this bubble, but they don't actually have any power, they can't actually change things, and they're kind of just shuttled off to the side, then what is kind of the grander problem that we can take away from this whole bubble problem?
Well, one of the things that I would say is that people who are working on Capitol Hill or working in various agencies or party offices, they need to stop viewing conservative media as some sort of proxy for the Republican voter or the Republican electorate. That's simply not been the case ever, and certainly is not the case now. And this has been a very real mistake that a lot of them have made. I've heard people, who I've talked to on the Hill, Capitol Hill, talk about, Red State wrote this mean post about something we said here. And I said, are you aware that almost nobody reads Red State? And not to single them out in specific, but, the reality is that a lot of these Republican staffers, they themselves are also very cocooned. And so they have a very distorted view of what they could do, or what their own base would be in support of. So, like, for instance, for a long time, and I haven't looked at it recently, but for a long time, a majority of Republican voters in surveys had said that they supported some sort of immigration legalization, and sometimes it was in favor of citizenship, sometimes it was something short of that. But the Republicans in Congress had this idea that because talk radio was upset about it, that all of their voters were upset about it, and that just wasn't the case. And another example was the budget showdown that Ted Cruz had tried to orchestrate over Obamacare before it fully got implemented in 2009. When he was doing this, there was this idea among a lot of Republicans that this is something that Republican voters wanted, that this was something that the Tea Party was there for and wanted. But when you look at polling of Republican voters, they said themselves that they didn't want a shutdown. And so there's all kinds of really serious mistakes that Republican leaders are letting themselves get into because they're not aware of just how unrepresentative conservative media are. So that's one thing that I would say, is to become more aware of that. But for conservatives, there is this, and this is something that has literally been the case for decades and decades and decades, over 50 years, 60 years, going back to even before the creation of National Review, that there's this idea that, well, the whole media is against us, and so therefore we shouldn't believe anything that comes out of them. And instead of trying to get the facts out ourselves or to research things and find out, what policies of the government might be causing harm to average people or national security or whatever, there's just this overwhelming lack of desire to do any reporting on the part of so many conservative media outlets, and some of that is a cost factor. I would certainly say that, but when you look at liberal activism versus conservative activism, liberals actually invest a lot more in media operations than conservatives do, which is really paradoxical when you consider just how much conservatives love to complain about the liberal media.
Right.
Well, they created the liberal media by their own laziness and their own lack of desire to actually take their views seriously.
Yeah, so this is one thing that I've tried to get at in some of the writing that I've done, is that I agree, and I don't know if you would as well, but I agree with the conservative critique that the mainstream media is, by and large, liberally biased. Now, I might not agree with the extent to which a lot of conservatives would say that, but I think, most journalists and most people who go into mainstream journalism have views that would be considered left of center in America. This colors their reporting, and kind of en masse, even if it's not a giant conspiracy, it's just a finger on the scales of what journalism in America looks like. Now, taking that into consideration, if conservatives want to fix that, they have two options. One is to infiltrate, which is train up legitimate journalists who just happen to have conservative views, or right-of-center views in the same kind of finger-on-the-scales way that most liberal journalists have, or build your own infrastructure. And it sure looks to me like conservatives have gone with the latter option. They've built their own infrastructure that has created, like you said, this bubble effect of a very small percentage of people paying attention, perhaps disproportionately the elites paying attention, like you said, on Capitol Hill, in the campaign apparatus and the policy world, who all think that being on Fox News is an incredibly important thing for a client or a congressperson or what have you. So if conservatives we have kind of built this alternative apparatus that nobody, at large is really paying attention to. So is it time to kind of go in a different direction? Do we need philanthropic billionaires to just pour money into, an infiltration operation to get people who are conservatives who want to be journalists hired at the New York Times, the Washington Post? And this happens, to be fair, a little bit. I think National Review, for example, their DC reporting office has had a lot of good veteran journalists go into kind of the mainstream media. One of the most prominent recent examples being Robert Costa, who headed up their DC reporting bureau for a while, who's now at the Washington Post. But that's kind of the aberration. That's the outlier. That's not the rule. Whereas we see on the left, people go from Salon, people go from the New Republic, people go from Talking Points Memo to NBC News, to CNN, to the New York Times. And it seems like, for me as an observer, that the kind of smaller time liberal media acts as a farm system for the big time mainstream media, whereas conservative journalists don't really ever want to make those kind of transitions.